All right, and then we'll kick off. So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. UXPA is excited to have Carolyn Jarrett host today's webinar. She'll be talking about surveys that work, an introduction to the Survey Octopus, and the total survey error. Please visit uxpa.org for future short courses and webinars. We have an upcoming webinar on diary studies in April, and we're currently doing a short course, which is the Intro to Trauma-Informed Design. We still have about 2 weeks left in that short course. The short courses are recorded, so if you're interested in possibly attending that short course, just sign up on the website. So without further ado, we have Carolyn here. I will let Carolyn take it away. And a little housekeeping items, everybody is on mute, but if you do have questions, please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A. And this will be recorded and available to you guys within 24 to 48 hours. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here. I'm just going to share my screen. I hope that worked and you can now see a little bit of octopus peeking out and total survey error. Does that seem okay, Khan? Just checking that you can see. Okay, great, excellent. Thank you very much. So I start with a question, which is, what would you do for $1? And this came up because I was surprised in reading a lot of the survey literature to discover that if you send a postal mail survey with $1 in the envelope, that dollar has more effect on the response rates than guaranteeing to pay people $10 later. And I found that quite a surprising result. And it was one of the things about surveys that really grabbed my attention. When I was looking into it, I discovered that this particular model, which really helped me, I've simplified it somewhat for my own purposes, but to think about people answering surveys approximately, it depends on what is the perceived amount of effort for that survey, what's the perceived reward, and to what extent do they trust you. So I found that the $1 in the envelope shows a little bit of trust. That's to say, of course, some people feel that they can just pocket the $1, but other people think, oh yeah, people have trusted me with the $1, and that's enough to give them that little extra boost. It creates a perceived reward. Here's a little bit of $1 straight away, and maybe that helps to counteract the perceived effort of looking through a mail survey. So I found that quite a compelling model to think about. And when I tried to apply it to another circumstance, I've asked people in many webinars, would you answer this survey? And people generally look at it and say no. It looks kind of spammy because of the clip art and the not very good choice of colors. So that reduces trust. It looks like it might be effort, and you're wondering what the reward is. And in this case, do we care about whether Luton is a great place to do business? Now, Luton happens to be a town that's quite near me, but it's not one I live in. So I just didn't have enough reward to want to do it. So I found that that model worked quite well for me. And in my work, I'm the form specialist, so I advise organizations on how to make forms easier to fill in particular things like tax forms. So I did a lot of work on the United Kingdom tax returns a few years ago. I found that really there's very little research written around on forms, but there's enormous amounts written about survey methodology. Survey methodology is one of the most researched areas. This is a snapshot of one of my bookshelves of survey methodology. And you can see that even on this shelf, there's quite a lot of books about answering questions, thinking about answers, questions about questions, and indeed books about survey methodology that made me think that I had a lot to learn from that area. And so I started reading in survey methodology, and then I found that people asked me about surveys. So I got questions like, please have a look at this survey, tell me whether this is a good question, how many people do I need in my sample, and the hardy favorite, will that be statistically significant? And so I thought, well, okay, I think I'll write a book about surveys, because it seemed easier than continuing to answer lots of survey questions. I was wrong, it wasn't easier, but I finally finished it, and I'm expecting that it will be published by Rosenfeld Media in maybe end of June, or perhaps a little earlier if things go well in production. So here I'm going to talk about some of the central concepts that I thought about in the book and how they might relate to those questions that people put to me. So we're going to have a little think about some of these topics. So first of all, please have a look at this survey. So that led me to think, well, what is a survey anyway? And find a definition. And the definition that I found in the survey methodology textbook, if you're not familiar with survey methodology, I think every single one of these people is an absolute hero in the world of survey methodology. And the definition they have is a survey is a systematic method for gathering information from a sample of entities for the purpose of constructing quantitative descriptors of the attributes of the larger population of which the entities are members. So I thought about that, and I thought, well, I really would like to simplify it a bit and change it maybe to sort of practice I have of maybe doing surveys often for user experience purposes. So I changed the definition a bit. So I swapped over a systematic method for process, because we tend to think of processes rather than systematic methods. I changed gathering information to asking questions, because these days we often do a lot of comparisons of other types of information. So we might be looking at, for example, call center records, or we might be looking at web analytics. But to me, the essence of a survey method is that we're going to ask some questions in it. Being somewhat user-centered, or trying to be, I changed entities to people, because I think people, we're always asking people to answer. And I swapped quantitative descriptors to numbers, because I feel more comfortable with that phrase. And finally, and probably this is the biggest cheat, I changed attributes of the larger population to make decisions. And that's because typically survey methodologists are doing surveys for national statistical institutes, such as in the US, you have the Census Bureau and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but practically every country has a National Statistical Institute, and they're doing surveys dominantly for data users to understand more about specific populations. But I've changed it to make decisions, because in everyday professional practice, what my colleagues are trying to do is to do a survey and then do something about some problem or issue that they have. So they need to make some kind of decision. So let's have a look at what that simpler definition comes out at. I have a survey as a process for getting answers to questions from typically a sample of people for the purpose of getting numbers so that you can use to make decisions. And let's just rearrange that. I've put the survey in the middle. Our aim overall is to make some decisions. We're going to get some answers from people, going to get some numbers in the end, and I have my survey process in the middle. And it turns out that a survey process has really quite a lot to think about. And so after a while of struggling with various things, I decided I would create a way of thinking about it. But that whole survey really is about starting with why and who, and then ending with a number. So that gives us our context. And then in the middle, then we have, sorry, I missed a bit. One of the things to remember then is that a survey is a quantitative method, that in the end, we're going to be asking some people and coming up with some numbers. And this matrix just compares some of the methods we use. So we've got observational things like watching people either in a usability test or field study, or getting some numbers through our analytics or A/B tests. And then we've got some ways of actually asking people. But the survey is a quantitative method. And so I really think it's quite important to remind colleagues that the result of a survey is a number. It seems quite surprising, but I've discovered that many colleagues believe that research and surveys are the same thing, and they're sometimes not that familiar with the idea that there's a range of methods that we can choose from. So quite often they come to me with the idea we need to do some research, but they phrase it as we need to do a survey. And a bit of investigation allows us to dig into that. For those who think my matrix is a little bit oversimplistic, it is. I adapted it from Christian Roer's map, which has many more methods, but I think we'll see some of the same things coming up. And you can use whichever you prefer. Both matrices have their merits depending on your particular circumstances and audience. Now, one of the things I very much learned from the survey methodologists is that they would interview before doing the survey. And again, many colleagues, I've seen the example where they say, well, let's do a survey first, a quick survey first, and then interview people in order to dig deeper into it. And I've learned that, in fact, it's much better to do a whole load of interviews first in order to refine your questions and make sure they're really ones that can be answered, and then turn them into a survey when you're sure that you're asking the right questions and you want to get a quantitative result at the end of the day. So I talked to colleagues about the goals for their survey, starting with what do you want to know? Why do you want to know it? And then we get really into the detail. What decision will you make based on these answers? Because often it's quite vague. And then finally, what number do you need to make the decision? Because that can be the point at which, just the other day, I was talking to some colleagues, they wanted to do a survey. By the time we got to what number do you need to make the decision, they realized they didn't need a number. They needed information that would be much better based on some interviews. And then we could decide maybe to go back to a survey later. So another key takeaway is to try and persuade people that it's not just a number. Matt, can you please stop typing? Okay. The aim of a survey is to get a number that will help with a decision. I'm afraid that's my husband typing, but he's going to stop. So let's have another look at that process. We've got why you wanted to ask, who you wanted to ask, and a number in the end. And then the survey in the middle is what we have to do in order to bring those three things together. And I discovered that there were many issues. And so what I ended up with was the octopus that I promised to introduce you today. So here's a cute little octopus sitting amongst those main aims. And now let's have a bigger look at him. The topics to create a great survey are all somewhat connected. So that's why I put them in an octopus, because we can see that it's not independent, that you look at one aspect and that will affect another one. But we'll try and have a quick look at what all these issues are through the rest of this webinar. And then because it's a sort of linear process, I did actually think, well, it will help people. You don't really want a messy process. You want something that tells you to start here and work through here. So I felt that we need to work out the goals for the survey, which would be the reason you're doing the survey. The questions that you ask, obviously, we have to look at questions. That's where I came into the world of survey methodology. And then we have to build them into a questionnaire of some sort. When people answer those questions, we get responses. And then eventually we turn those answers into a report. But we have to think about the people we're working with. So to do that, we need to start with some kind of list that we sample from and think about how to create a sample from that list, or indeed to ask everyone, but that has its challenges as well. And then I borrowed the word fieldwork from the survey methodologists and our other close colleagues, the market researchers, who tend to talk about putting a survey in a field, which I particularly enjoy at the moment, because as it happens, at the moment, I'm mainly working on farming, where of course fields has a completely different answer. But it stems from the days when interviewers would literally go out to farms in the field and ask the questions. So that's why we call it field work, even though now most of the things we do are fielded remotely, either through web methods or by post mail. And then finally, some of the people who answer. So we have some of the people who respond, which is the entire response that they give us, and then the answers you get in those responses. And it all comes together into a report, some kind of way of telling people what we found, and hopefully they can make a decision. So if you prefer, I've created that as a linear process, starting from goals and sample and working through to reports. And all of these slides are Creative Commons, and I always prefer to actually show the slides to people at the webinar first, and then I'll be putting them online over the next couple of days, probably, once I've checked things like have they got the appropriate alt text for all the images. So you'll see their Creative Commons license, which means I urge you to share them, providing you keep them Creative Commons. But if we look back to the overall process, remember we were just looking at what number do you need to make a decision in order to do the goals. And you'll see that in the linear process, those things look quite disconnected. We've got decision right over on the right and goals right over on the left. But actually, in real life, we have to think of them together. So just remember, if you do prefer a linear process, that there's a lot of loops and thinking about bits that you're not currently doing in order to make good decisions. So that kind of shows why I think of a survey as being the whole thing. But let's just have a quick look at questions. So again, I get asked whether something is a good question. So here's a question which I think is very familiar. Would you recommend us to a friend or family member? And there's been considerable discussion, I think, in user experience in general to say, is this a good question? So let's just think about, would you recommend us to a friend or family member from the point of view of being a brand, some kind of shop or online shop that's selling clothing? We might say, well, what do you want to know? Well, we actually do want to know whether someone will recommend them, because word recommend us as a shop, because whether people recommend you in a retail environment is very important. And then we might say, well, why do you want to know? And we might say, well, you know, what's our brand equity looking like? We want to compare those numbers over time. Is there some investigation we need to do? And then we might say, well, what number do you need to make a good decision? And now we can see that sometimes there's good reasons, which is we might investigate and fix problems that might be affecting that recommendation rule. And I'm afraid to be honest, I'm afraid some of us know that some organizations are using this for some bad reasons. So they may punish staff who get less than 10 out of 10. And these days, it's not completely uncommon for staff to beg us to give them a 10 rating, because otherwise they'll get punished. So unfortunately, the question can be subverted somewhat. But if we look at this question from another circumstance, such as a hospital ward, then it becomes very weird. And I have genuinely been given this question in a hospital ward, like, what do you want to know? What on earth does it mean to recommend a hospital ward where I was being treated for quite a serious illness to a friend or family member? I mean, I can't speak too highly of them. They were fantastic. They mended me and I'm fine. But do I want to recommend that? No, obviously not. And then it turned out why you want to know was not because it was any use to the ward, but it was because someone else said they had to. And it's quite weird, I mean, incomprehensible what decision they might make. So it's like, it's not necessarily a bad question, but it can become a very bad question taken out of context. And then there's another way in which questions can go wrong, which is, this was a survey that I thoroughly enjoyed doing. It was about crafting, and I love my crafting. And it was a perfectly sensible question about sewing. And yet, in this case, it was quite tricky to answer because it looked as though whoever did it never actually tested it on a mobile. And yet I wanted to take the survey on a mobile for lots of reasons. And in fact, the rate of response to surveys goes up if you make sure that people can do them on mobiles, because if they're going to be done at all, it's because people are filling in a little gap in their day. It's great to make sure your surveys actually work in the context they're going to be used. So this is an example of another question. It's a fine question, but the limitations of the technology have made it quite tricky. So one of the things that we really need to do, and indeed as survey methodologists definitely do a lot of this now, is not just interviewing, but then testing, doing a usability test, possibly doing a field study, and in fact, testing the field work using a pilot before the survey actually goes out. So bringing all those traditional usability practitioner or user experience practitioner skills to that survey, as well as actually doing the survey. And really, I can only tell you whether a question is a good question by testing it with the people who will answer it in their proper context. So it's all about the testing. I thought we ought to have a look at one of the fun questions, which is how many people do I need in my sample? And to do that, we're going to visit the octopus. So we're back to the octopus and we're going to try and work out how many people we need. So our first question actually starts, surprisingly, down here in the field work. So we need to start with the number of answers we need, and then we can work back to find out how many people we have to ask. So for example, I'll just run through a conversation which is slightly anonymized from a client. So I say, well, who's going to answer? How many answers do you need? And they said 10,000. Well, okay, you need 10,000 answers. That's fine. I didn't really dig into why, but someone obviously thought that was a good number. So we start there. Now, if you remember back at the beginning, I was saying that the number of people who answer will depend very much on their perceived reward, why you're doing it. So let's have a look back. Think a bit about, well, how many questions? In fact, I've skipped slightly. That's about perceived effort. You know, if you ask one question, you'll get a higher response rate. If you ask 200 questions, you'll get a lower response rate, all other things being equal. So in this case, I said to the client, well, how many questions are you asking and what sort of things are they about? They said, well, we're asking about 20 questions. So, okay, it's not too bad. I've definitely seen surveys longer than that. It's not an unreasonable number. And then say, well, okay, are those number of questions, is that sensible considering the reason you're doing it? So the reason you're doing it brings us back to the goals. Why are you asking? Is helping your organization a reward in itself, or are you offering some other kind of incentive? Going back to the dollar in the envelope idea, maybe. And they said, again, pretty normal type of answer, well, we want to make improvements to this particular website that we're thinking about. Okay, that's fine. Making improvements, people might well be motivated to do that. It seems like a plausible answer. So let's then think about, well, who are you going to ask? And that, when we're actually asking, do you have some kind of list you're going to sample from, or how are you going to think about who the people are that you'll ask? So for example, recently I was discussing with some colleagues where they were getting the list, and they got a list of customers. And those customers, it's a little bit tricky. There's some issues between the organization and the customers. I said, well, how's it going? How do your users feel about that? And it turned out that they were getting as many issues of people saying that they wanted to opt out as people who were from all future research. as people who actually responded. So there's obviously some problems about how the users feel about this. But going back to my imagined customer, it's not uncommon to get an answer like this: well, we're going to ask anyone. And as user experience professionals, I don't need to tell you about trying to refine down from it could be anyone to something that is actually a plausible definition of their users. Just as a quick tip, I generally start with my 7-year-old nephew Marcus, of whom I'm inordinately proud. And generally I start with, well, would my 7-year-old nephew be part of that anyone? And that normally opens the conversation up a bit to say, well, no, probably not Marcus. But so we start to actually think through some of who the people really are. But who is on that list really matters. So we've done quite a bit of looking around, and finally we can think again about how we're actually asking. So how you're delivering the questionnaire also matters. Response rates vary very greatly according to the method. For example, in the olden days when we still had face-to-face teaching, I might have 20 people in the room and I would hand them the feedback survey at the end of the course and not let them leave the room until they handed it in, and I would get 100% response rate typically. I mean, 1 or 2 people would need to sneak out, but it would be pretty close. These days in remote teaching, it could be a far lower response rate because it's something people have to do when they've gone back to their normal everyday lives. And so now we're getting completely different response rate. So coming back to my made up, somewhat anonymized client, I might say, well, how are you delivering the questionnaire? And they might say something like, well, I'm going to have a banner on the website, at which point my heart sinks, because it's not as if you won't get any responses to a banner on the website, but response rates are extremely low. So it's very difficult to get people to even notice a banner on a website, much less respond to it. But if that's what they want to do, that's where we start. And then we have a negotiation about some of those issues. So we come through just to think a little bit. I mean, these are some possible response rates. A mailed paper survey is a novelty these days. You very rarely get one, and it's still possible to get a response rate up to 70%. So you might send 1,000 out and you might hope to get as many as 700 back. You can get pretty decent responses by email, actually. If you very carefully design the invitation, it's a specific one-off survey with a very clear understanding, it's not too long, and you don't ask too many people, you can still get response rates in the 20% or even possibly better. So you might send 1,000 invitations and get 200 responses. I think we're all familiar with the routine email after every transaction, where I've optimistically hoped we might get as much as 5% response rate. Possibly that's dropping all the time. Many of us simply ignore a lot of those things these days. But I'm being optimistic and saying we might get 50 people to respond from 100,000 invitations. And then the banner invitation on a website, response rates are terrible. You might, if you're lucky, get under 0.1%. So you might get 1 in 1,000 visitors actually clicks through if they're quite well motivated. So it very much depends on how. So just to summarize what we've been having a look at, there are many influences on pop-up rates. I'll come back to questions at the end if that's okay. Just make sure I remember them. We've looked at how you're asking, how many answers you needed, why you're asking, what you're asking, the type of questionnaire you make, who you're asking, lots of influences on the response rate. And for my hypothetical thing, now I'm going to work out the sample, the number of people I'm actually going to ask. It's a relatively simple calculation in the end, but there's lots of influences go into it. So let's have a look at working through from the response rate. I've said, well, it's a website banner. I might get 1 in 1,000, 0.1%. Why you're asking, perfectly reasonable, no change. That probably won't diminish the response rate. What I'm asking, 20 questions, that's quite long. I think I better reduce the response rate a bit from that. The type of questionnaire, it pops up when you click the banner. Yep, no change there. That's a standard thing. If people are willing to click on the banner at all, that's what they're expecting. Who you're asking, any website visitor. Not very personal. It's not making people feel that they're the special person who's been asked. So I think that diminishes the response rate at all. So I end up with a possible eventual response rate of 1 in 25,000. And you'll see I've got to ask or get an enormous amount of traffic to get to those 10,000 responses. So just quickly, Ted and Isabel asked, what about on-site intercept pop-ups? Response rates for them are terrible, unless it's very well crafted. And a lot of the on-site intercepts I've seen are being wasted because people are popping up the intercept and asking, are you willing to answer a survey? So they are gathering answers we already know, which is most people are not willing to answer a survey. So for the few people who bother to answer it at all, most of them will say, no, I don't want to answer. So if you really do want to use an on-site intercept, I would strongly recommend you try and craft that as actually an interesting question in its own right, and only maybe stick to just one question. And then maybe if you really need to, have a supplementary question, ideally in the same intercept, about whether people are willing to go on to answer a longer survey. So we got to response rate. But there's more. It's not just about the response rate, it's also thinking about the entire survey, which is when we get those 10,000 answers back in, we've got to actually deal with them. So remember that I had a need for 10,000 answers to 20 questions per response. That's 200,000 data items. Now, clearly, those 200,000 data items is a lot of work. A lot of them are going to be fairly straightforward numeric, but probably some of those 20 questions are going to have longer answers. So if you get 10,000 answers, you're also committing to, let's say, processing at least 10,000 qualitative comments. That's a lot of work. And quite often you don't really need to do that much work. Many national important samples, for example, the American Community Survey, on which government decisions are based, gets away with quite a lot smaller sample than that. So it's quite crucial to think about how much work you really want to do in order to get the answer that you can use. And one of the things that you can do really is, rather than think, oh, Caroline put a random made up number, informed number into this webinar, what you should really do is to say, okay, let's run a pilot test. Let's see how it goes. Let's test that survey on a small group of people and see how my particular audience really reacts to it. So a question that's popped up in the chat was, do response rates vary when your entire audience is internal? Absolutely, they do. And many of us are familiar with the concept of the annual people survey, and then lots and lots of pressure for managers and others to say, please respond to the people survey because we haven't got enough response so far. People, you must respond, otherwise this will affect you, which is okay. It's a request from a figure of authority is a well-known tactic for improving response rates to a survey, but you might also think whether that will then change the answers you get to the questions that you ask. If people feel under pressure, they may not feel quite as honest in their answers. So it's very much a question of balancing all the factors. Do you really need all of those answers? So long story short, a sample size calculation needs the whole Survey Octopus. I think I better make sure I answer the questions at the end, because I think I might find I'm going off at a tangent, even though the questions are really great. So I'll come back to the questions at the end, because I really do want to fit in statistically significant. will that be statistically significant? So one of the reasons why people ask for things like 10,000 responses is because they are anxious about whether they're going to get statistically significant response, which is perfectly plausible. So let's have a quick look at that. One of the things that I try and then discuss with clients is what type of significance do you need? So I'd like to draw a distinction between a result that is statistically significant, which is one that is mathematically unlikely to be the result of chance, and where you need to think about things like what size of an effect are you looking for, what is your null hypothesis, what's your testable hypothesis, and how you're going to work out the mathematics to see the difference between them. And I think typically our clients mostly want, or our colleagues mostly want, a result that's significant in practice, which means they want to be sure that they've got a robust number that they can rely on and that's meaningful in the real world. They don't want to end up with something that's some kind of anomaly because they happen to ask the wrong people. And so typically what we're really looking for is significant in practice rather than statistically significant. But unfortunately, the phrase statistically significant has become stuck in everyone's mind as the crucial one. So one of the things to look at in the survey, in the Octopus, is that there's sort of errors going on. The statistically significant one comes from sampling error, which is a mathematical property dominantly when you ask a sample rather than the entire list. But if we look at the other side, we can see that there's potential lack of validity. So if the questions you ask don't match the reason you're doing it, you can end up with a survey that lacks validity. So for example, if your aim is to improve the quality of care in a hospital, but you ask about recommending that ward to a family or friend, the question isn't really matching the quality of care. And so you end up with a lack of validity. So I'd love to dig into this some more because I love the whole topic of asking questions and getting the right answer. But I'm just going to quickly sum it up for this webinar by saying asking one person the right question gets better results than asking 10,000 people the wrong question. So we have to actually balance how many people we ask and how much effort we put into asking the right questions with overall how many people we ask. And then another thing that brought great joy to my heart is that a couple of years ago, a large number of very eminent and influential statisticians banded together to rise up against statistical significance. And in fact, I recommend this article to you. The cartoon shows statistical significance being shown into a room with other outdated and long forgotten scientific theories, which is maybe a little harsh. The scientists basically say, you know, statistical significance is just one statistical tool and it has achieved a dominance which is not appropriate. It's a bit like saying, for everything I need to cut, whether it's from cutting a bit of butter to spread on some bread at breakfast, through to felling an entire forest, I'm always going to use a chainsaw. Because a chainsaw is a fine tool, particularly in the right hands with a skilled operator. But a chainsaw isn't a convenient tool if you just need to chop up a few veggies for your lunch. So it's a question of saying it's a tool, but it's not the entire tool. And so there were so many different things you can do in statistics. I'm not a statistician, I want to make that obvious. But what we really need is to think about significance in practice and about what sort of numbers we need and how they will help us make decisions. And often a straightforward count, which is well within my capability, is good enough to get a flavour of it. So let's just have a quick look at another crucial error before I dive into some questions, which I'll do in a minute. So another crucial error is what happens when the people who respond isn't everyone. So there's a potential for non-response error, which is where we get some people dropping out between the sample we ask and the ones who actually respond. So non-response error is quite complicated, but I'll explain, I hope. Non-response error happens when the people who do not respond are different to the people who do respond in a way that affects your decision. So sometimes people respond or don't respond completely at random, in which case that will not affect the decision overall. But sometimes they are different. So for example, we might get an under response from people who do not trust your organization, in which case you will get a more positive response than you might if everybody responded. And that's the essence of non-response error. So I'd like just to give a little example from my friend Jane, who teaches workshops to help people feel more comfortable about their lives. And she told me this story where recently she's had 20 people attend an online workshop and everyone seemed to enjoy it. But when she sends back a web survey afterwards, she only gets 3 or 4 responses back. And as she put it, if we rely on those responses, we might be at risk of making bad decisions. Because it could be that the people who didn't respond felt uncomfortable in some way about communicating, or they just didn't like her enough to want to respond. And so now she's changing over to randomly choosing half the people to phone. So she can actually see if the survey is working, what people want, and how much they get back. So I thought it was an interesting example to say sometimes one of the solutions could be to accept that there was a non-response error and then actually change the method to try and combat it. So there's errors all the way around the Survey Octopus. Measurement error happens when the questions you ask are not interpreted by the people who answered in the same way, and they don't give the accurate answer, but they give a different answer. Processing error happens dominantly. Processing error happens actually if you do mail surveys and you have to type the answers in, but it can also happen, for example, if you're coding qualitative answers and you don't get that coding quite right. On the right-hand side, we have coverage error. So, for example, sometimes you just accept the error. Sometimes you make compromises that you knowingly have to make compromises in one area in order to move your research forward. So, for example, a colleague of mine the other day decided that the coverage error happens when the people you want to answer are not well represented in the list. In her case, she was using a list of people with email addresses, and she knew that some of her customers don't have access to email. But she accepted that as a short-term problem because that was good enough for the research, and she was willing to accept that compromise for this round and then think about how to get people who don't have email in a later version of the research. We've looked at sampling error, we've looked at non-response error, and for the statisticians amongst you, adjustment error arises when you do weighting or statistical adjustments based on the sampling method you used, and there's things that aren't quite right in those adjustment errors. So those are all the errors, and those are all the things to think about. But my point here really about the whole octopus is that significance in practice comes from making good decisions throughout the survey. So whether you've ended up with a quality result that you can really make use of is about looking at the whole octopus throughout the survey. Now, some of you may feel that actually in your professional context, you can't really give a Disney-esque sort of cheery octopus. So this slide is available for you, which has the same considerations, but in a slightly more formal way of putting it. It's the same thing, but it's a dismembered octopus here. Overall, we're thinking about the aim is to get the best number you can within the resources that you have. And this is an opportunity to discuss some of those things with your colleagues, if that appeals to you more. And some of you may prefer to actually think, well, I'd actually like to stand this up by reading some of the literature myself, which is absolutely fair enough as well. So this version is taking it back to really where I got it from. It uses terms from survey methodology. There's some slight changes in how it works. So instead of asking what you want to ask about, it talks about a construct. Measurement is the same, response the same, and edited response is a version of the answers you actually use. And on the right-hand side, representation is about representing a population or who we want to ask. Sampling frame is the same. Sample and respondents are people who answer, and then post-survey adjustments, that's about deciding whose answers you use and whether you weight them. And we all end up with a survey statistic. So these are just much more searchable within the literature because they're more specific terms used in the literature. And there's plenty of literature to engage with if you'd like to do so. I found my reading survey methodology has been really fascinating. And then if you want to go for the full total survey error diagram, this is the original diagram as in my favorite textbook, which shows all of the different errors with the mathematical symbols of how you add them up and how you work out your estimates and therefore do some manipulations. So my aim overall in this webinar, and indeed in my book, is to, I hope, show you that there are quite a lot of complications in here, but I hope by now this this possibly slightly terrifying diagram should have no further fear for you. So that is what I mostly wanted to talk about today. And as say, my book is coming out in the summer or in about June or thereabouts. And I think that I've got some questions. So I'm going to, I hope, answer some of the questions that I've had. I answered one in flight, and I'm also hoping that there's some questions come up. So let me see if I can start with Rafaela's question. Curious to know what the color tags stand for. Nothing really, I just color coded them a bit because I thought it looked more cheery. And I went with a sort of rainbow color because I like rainbows. Denise asked, do I have a favorite book about surveys and why? There are so many. I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed reading Don Dillman's books, and indeed I admire Don Dillman as an author so much that I buy each new edition of his survey books and keep all the old ones. So I'd heartily recommend them to you. They look quite off-putting, but once you've actually start reading them, you'll find that they're very engagingly written, really. And another one that I would heartily recommend is a very thin little book by Annie Pettit called People Aren't Robots. And that's a sort of at the other end. It's no more than 70 pages, and it's about how to ask better questions from market research perspective. So those are two that I'm able to recommend. I answered a bit about response rates varying when the entire audience is internal. Absolutely, they vary all the time. I think in the chat, there were also some questions about response rates varying. Really, the only real answer is to actually find out what your response rate is to run pilot tests. To find out what your response rate is actually going to be with your audience. Pilot test means just do your whole survey from beginning to end, but with a smaller group. I would typically choose maybe to run a pilot test with 20 to 100 people, see how it's going, and then work on that. Shortly after that, Aaron asked about, I'm curious about how certain entities get the answers they need with fewer responses. They worked really, really hard on them is the answer. I mean, I was so impressed when I discovered how much testing the survey methodologists do, how much piloting, how many interviews. For example, in the US and the UK, we have 10 yearly censuses, and typically the testing for the next census starts before the previous one is finished. So the amount of testing is astonishing, and they investigate everything. So, you know, really working on the testing. Barbara asked about platforms offering AI solutions to process and tag a wide number of open text comments. That is an entirely whole other thing. You can get some value from AI, but in my everyday professional life, I've started to go back to offer artificial intelligence feasibility investigation. And I have to say, I've not been very impressed so far with how much AI in practice has improved. You may be able to get some value if it's fairly straightforward sentiment mining, like is this generally a positive or negative comment, but sentiment mining, even sentiment mining, isn't very good at distinguishing between yeah, right, is that a positive or a negative comment? You know, it's quite tricky. So I've not been very thrilled at all with what the AI can do for us, I'm afraid. Shortly after that, somebody asked, sorry, the names have got, Mansour asked, with people surveys, is there a particular problem with people focusing on response rates and not actually talking much about results? I'm going to treat that as a rhetorical comment, because yes, you know, for example, I've seen people being far more focused on, I've seen people take people surveys extremely seriously, and I've seen other people treat them as something that you have to do without actually thinking about it. It so much depends on the individual organization, I'm afraid. And Kyle, shortly after that, said that my quote about asking, you get better data from asking one person the right question to then asking 10,000 people the wrong question. Very good point. Asking one person nullifies the power of a survey by implying biased results of an individual. That is absolutely correct. That it's a compromise we make, you know, it's a compromise you make between saying, are we going to not worry about measurement error, which is about asking the wrong question, and focus only on sampling error? You know, it's all connected, unfortunately. And that is just part of the subtleties of this, that it's not entirely about one thing, it's all very connected. And then Anne, shortly after that, asked about, do you agree that significance in practice may be problematic if that introduces subjectivity? Yes, I do agree. How do we determine what's meaningful in the real world? We have to investigate it. I mean, it's not a straightforward method, a survey. It's got a lot of complexity in it. That's part of the fun. It makes it very interesting, but it also means it's one of the challenging methods, really. If you're going to do a really solid survey, you have to put some effort into it. So yes, those are great questions, and I don't have answers to them. And thank you for asking them. And Glenn asked, why do we ask at all about statistical significance for surveys? Isn't something to, wouldn't it be better to think of a different method, such as an A/B testing or double blind? Very true. I think, Glenn, your question shows that you are pretty much into the whole statistical piece. And one of the, it takes me back to the matrix that I put up at the beginning or fairly early on, which is to say that often I think colleagues come to us and say, we want to do a survey, when actually they mean we want to do some research. And so opening that up to which is the right method for the type of investigation they want to do can be exactly where we open that conversation. And Glenn pointed out that they can't see the relevance of simple surveys. And to be honest, I agree. I rarely actually end up doing any statistical tests on my surveys. I generally end up simply reporting the results. Duncan asked about how effective or ineffective are surveys for capturing qualitative answers. Yes, you can use a survey. One of the problems is that sometimes people use a survey tool because they need some qualitative answers, perhaps on a more interview basis, where it's more convenient for everyone to use a survey tool to capture a bunch of qualitative answers rather than sending an email or doing a phone call. That isn't necessarily a survey. It's more of an interview that's been administered through using a survey tool. So that may sound as if I'm really being very nitpicky here, but it's a question of, if basically you don't need a number, then you might be doing a different method, but you might choose to use a survey tool to make that method happen, but doesn't necessarily make it a survey. So I don't know if that was clear enough. And then I'm beginning to slightly run out of time, but I'll see what I can do. Judy asked, given the large effort of paper surveys, how come the response rate can be so high? One of the reasons is that people who do paper surveys are typically, paper surveys are quite rare. People have chosen the method when they're expecting to invest a lot of effort into it. And so they're very well designed and extremely well tested. And these days, paper surveys are a rare beast. We rarely get them. And so they have a novelty factor, which means that they can get more attention. So it's more design effort. Yes, it is a larger effort, but you can get a higher reward. And overall, you can find your cost per response is actually relatively good. And our last couple of questions, Arnes asked, how do I convince my clients that statistical significance is not so necessary? Well, I hope some of the discussion I've made about thinking about the whole octopus might be exactly where we go. And I'm really sorry, but I think I've run out of time. I hope that I've managed to cover quite a few of your answers, and I'm really sorry for anyone I haven't quite managed to get to. So my final, somebody asked, will my book be on Amazon? And the answer is yes, it will. Rosenfeld Media, like all independent publishers, would be extremely grateful if you could buy the book directly from them when it comes out, because dealing with Amazon for them is a nightmare, but it will definitely be on Amazon. If that's your preferred method, I wouldn't want you to be put off. It will be on Amazon. So thank you so much. I'd love to have been able to answer every single question, and I think I've got to the majority of them, and I'm going to have to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn, for an awesome webinar. You can tell by the responses in the chat that this is one that was very well received. So thanks, Carolyn, for coming today to talk to our members and presenting this awesome webinar. Again, can't wait for the book. I'm hoping Carolyn can join us again in the May-June time frame and talk a bit about the book. And have an opportunity to promote that. So this was excellent. Again, this is recorded. It will be sent out. And yeah, thank you very much, Carolyn.
Thank you. It's an absolute pleasure, and I really appreciate the questions. I hope that Calm will have a way of capturing any questions I haven't answered in the chat, and then maybe I can persuade her to let me come back and do another webinar sometime for some of the questions that I wasn't able to get round to, some of the important points. So thanks very much, everybody.
Yep, and I have all of the questions captured, so.
Okay, great.
Absolutely.
In particular, Candice asked, do I have a take on number of points in a rating scale? Yes, I do. I actually even had some bonus slides on that, but I just didn't have time to do them and answer the excellent questions that people had given. So sorry about that, Candice, but maybe another time.
Absolutely. Well, this was great. Thank you so much, Carolyn. And you guys have a good rest of your day. All righty?
Okay.
Take care. Bye-bye.